So in this final lesson, what we're going to do is take a look at problems with indirect realism. We looked at direct realism, we looked at problems with direct realism, we now looked at indirect realism. Now we're just going to finish off by looking at some problems with indirect realism. So we're going to recap, we're going to explain what indirect realism is, and then we're going to look at two main problems. We're going to look at the resemblance problem and the problem of infinite regress. Okay, and then we're going to summarize everything and conclude the course. So what is indirect realism? That's what we're going to ask again. What is indirect realism? So as we've already noted, indirect realism is the philosophical theory which states that our perceptions have an indirect relationship with mind-independent objects and events. So with direct realism, there is a direct relationship between the perception and the mind-independent object. Like I said in other lessons, if I'm perceiving this water bottle, what I'm doing is I'm having a direct relationship between my mind and this mind-independent object. We've already noted that that is an interestingly controversial position to hold because of the illusion argument and the hallucination argument. And then we said, well, okay, what about indirect realism? What about we have a direct relationship to somehow this kind of mind-dependent sense data, but what we don't have is the direct relationship between our mind and the mind-independent object. So Locke came up with a very interesting explanation of this indirect realism. He said that a subject, perceives an object if and only if the subject has some idea of that object. And that's how it's formalized. There are a few objections to this theory. There are two main objections to this theory. However, you could probably think of other ones as well, and that's what I want to really get at in the discussion section. So the first problem we're going to look at is called the resemblance problem. And basically, if we explain sense data theory and the indirect realist view of sense data theory, what it's saying is that we see external objects in virtue of seeing sense data. We see the sense data of this object, okay? And what allows us to have unique experiences of perception is that the sense data is supposed to have some kind of resemblance of this mind-independent object. So we have a direct relationship with the sense data, and the sense data resembles the water bottle, for example. But how does the sense data do this? It doesn't actually explain how sense data is able to have any kind of resemblance to a mind-independent object. Because as we already know, mental entities are mental. They are non-spatial, okay? They are within the mind. So how can mental entities have any kind of resemblance of the real world? And this is an interesting thing that Berkeley came up with. He suggested that it is evident that an idea can be like nothing but another idea. He suggested that no matter how much you try to make an idea resemble something in the real world, it will never resemble it to a sufficient standard. So effectively, an idea can be nothing like anything other than another idea. That is what he suggested. Now, some people take a very strong conclusion to this. So according to Berkeley, a mental entity does indeed have the capacity to resemble another mental entity. So sense data can resemble other kinds of sense data, but it doesn't have the capacity to resemble anything in the real world. So the sense data theory falls down and collapses, according to Berkeley. And he concludes that the very notion of what is called matter involves a contradiction in it. So Berkeley takes a very strong stance. He suggests that if we take the resemblance problem and we assume that indirect realism has some problems, that therefore there's nothing that in reality beyond mind-dependent objects. So when one looks at the resemblance problem, they go down the road of suggesting that there's no such thing as a mind-independent object. This water bottle doesn't actually exist. And arguably that's quite a strong objection. That takes a very intuitive objection, the idea that the sense data theory doesn't actually explain resemblance, okay? It isn't able to explain resemblance. and then we go take that and then conclude that there's no such thing as a mind-independent object. That's very strong. So we can look at other ways we can come to a different conclusion in the discussion section. Secondly, there's the regress problem. Okay, some philosophers suggest that indirect realism is committed to an infinite regress of perceptions. So it goes a little bit like this. This is how it seems to how it works effectively. You perceive a car in virtue of perceiving a mental image of that car, sense data of that car. Okay, but in order to do this, you must perceive that mental image in virtue of perceiving a mental image of the mental image of the car. Okay, but in order to do this, you must perceive a mental image in virtue of perceiving a mental image of the mental image of perceiving a mental image of the car. Okay, so as you can see, if we are to explain the sense data theory in this way, by talking about something in virtue of perceiving a mental image of said mind-independent object, what we seem to have is an infinite regress problem. It doesn't actually solve any issue. It just becomes an infinite loop. Okay. This isn't very convincing though. It's quite a bad objection, because what it's doing is it's effectively strawmanning the sense data theory, because it is coming up with it's creating a straw man of the sense data theory. This isn't actually what sense data theory suggests. And then it's using that to try and disprove it, which isn't true, okay? Because the indirect realist isn't claiming anything about perceiving an image in virtue of anything else. The indirect realist is just simply stating that you perceive the car indirectly by directly perceiving a mental image of it. There's nothing about something being in virtue of something else. So that's where the infinite regress problem falls down. The resemblance problem is a little bit more difficult to tackle. That's why I left it out of this presentation, so that we could discuss it in the discussion section and have a look at how one might want to tackle the resemblance problem. But the infinite regress problem is really easy, just to claim that it's a straw man and then move on, because it really isn't a very strong objection. Are these objections convincing to you? Is the resemblance problem convincing to you? I'd be surprised if the infinite regress problem was convincing to you, but hey ho, if you've got a way to explain why the infinite regress problem is actually valid, then put it down in the discussion section, do it. So in summary, for indirect realism, we've looked at how we might be able to object to the idea of indirect realism. Okay, we've taken a look at two main objections: the resemblance problem and the infinite regress problem. And as a course summary, we have really gone over a lot of. We've taken an introductory perspective of the philosophy of perception. We've taken a very introductory role. Okay, we've begun to look at the philosophy of direct realism and the idea of this openness to the world. And then we start to look at objections with direct realism, with the illusion and hallucination arguments. And then we moved on to an alternative, the indirect realist sense data theory of perception. And then we looked at objections with that. So thank you for watching. Make sure you have a go at the course project. There are a number of essay kind of questions, short questions. There'll be some further reading as well if you want to really get back into it and read in a lot more detail. And make sure you look at some of the reading too. I will be doing a more advanced philosophy of perception, but for now I'm just taking an introductory look at different interesting areas of philosophy. So if you want a more advanced philosophy of perception, where we go into a lot more detail of all of these different theories, and also even new theories like adverbalism, for example, we're going to go and have a look at that as well. So thank you for watching.